affected.
I'm sorry, the sound broke up just a little bit. The very last part of what you said.
I was wondering if all the functions of the brain came back to the areas that were affected.
Okay, I think that depends greatly on how extensive the damage is and also how long the damage has happened. Okay, I think that what you would see if you did ongoing SPECT scans of brains is that the longer that an individual is sober and healthy and living in better places, the more of those holes will fill in. However, I also think that with any damage that's done, there is always the potential of some of it not coming back. You know, it's just, think of it, you know, someone's in a car wreck and they've got some, they get some spinal damage, and so they have numbness, and so, you know, doctors will often tell a patient, okay, we think there's real hope once the swelling goes down and once healing takes place that you will gain more feeling and movement back, but we don't know for sure how much that will be until time passes. And I think the same thing's true with the brain, is that whatever damage an individual has done in addiction, any kind of addiction, there is always the potential to have done enough damage that certain portions never fully recover. And yet, I'm amazed at how much, you know, even in those pictures and those slides, you can see a significant amount of change in just 1 year's time.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing to see also. I was also wondering if the addicted brains look the same in the scans for women as they did for men.
Yes and no. I'm not a brain scan expert. I found some really good brain scans that illustrate the points I already wanted to make, if that makes sense. But yeah, those SPECT scans, and you know, you can spend quite a bit of time on Dr. Amen's website looking at different brain scans that they've done, and there's a lot of similarities between, you know, especially with the chemical addictions, you know, with the marijuana, the opiums, different strong chemical addictions. You're going to see very similar kind of damage. My guess would be that because of the way that female sexual addiction often manifests itself in different ways than male sexual addiction does, that it's going to do similar damage but in kind of slightly different places, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Destiny, do you have one?
Yeah. Do parents or like caretakers, do they kind of control whether a child will become addicted based on how they raise them in the first few years?
Control is always an illusion. I'll give you a phrase that I took from Dr. Larry Crabb years ago, and that is that that we have influence but never control. All right. And a good way of thinking of that in parenting and in taking care of children is that we all have take from Dr. Jim Wilder, we have what we call a joy capacity level. All right, you remember in the video when I talked about the rhythm of joy and quiet, and how when a parent, when someone who is caring for a child, you know, smiles at them and they share joy, and the joy gets magnified and gets shared back and forth, and then the baby looks away because the baby needs to rest, and the parent lets them rest and they come back, that when that process takes place in a child's life, naturally or maybe even contrived, you know, you guys are in a great place. You now know that grows that portion of the baby's brain, and you play with the child and say, oh cool, I'm helping the baby grow its brain, and this is a lot of fun. Okay? But as a child experiences parents and other adults loving on them, engaging them, then what they do is they raise the child's joy capacity. All right? And so if you can picture it this way, picture a 5-gallon bucket. And the more that a child is loved on, cared for, etc., the more, picture it like water in a 5-gallon bucket. I believe God's designed us in childhood to get our buckets completely full to the rim. Because God knows that there's going to be a lot of painful things happening in our lives. All right? Now, what you need to understand, though, is that very, very few of us get a full 5-gallon bucket. Most of us get maybe a gallon and a half, 2 gallons. Some of us got just a few ounces in there. All right? And what happens is, in life, we can handle the same amount of pain as we can handle, as our joy capacity is. Okay, so if you can picture this 5-gallon bucket, if you've got 3 gallons of water in there, 3 gallons of joy capacity, you can handle up to 3 gallons of pain. But if you get 3 gallons and 1 ounce of pain, guess what happens? Your brain goes into trauma. Whenever your pain exceeds your capacity, your brain goes into a trauma mode that is basically a survival mode. And in survival mode, I don't care what it takes, what it costs, who I have to step over, who I have to hurt. I'm going to do anything I can to shut off the pain. And that's primarily where sexual addiction and other addictions come from, is that we are in painful places and we look for anything necessary to kill the pain. And so the way that parents and others have great influence on on the long-term health and effect of a child is by how much joy capacity they pour into the child. Okay? It also helps us understand why the same bad thing can happen to 2 different people and one person be completely destroyed by it and another person be okay. Okay, for example, kind of the best example of that is, think of our military. There may be two soldiers in Iraq walking down the path and both experience seeing one of the guys in their company get blown up by stepping on a landmine. All right? If one of the guys has a strong capacity level already, then it's a very painful event. It hurts. It's tragic. He may have some flashbacks and some memories, etc., but he can get through it and be okay. If his buddy standing beside him, however, came from a very dysfunctional, painful family of origin and only had, 6 ounces in his bucket, well, then he may go into complete PTSD and all sorts of trauma and etc. Does that help make more sense?
Yeah.
So parents and caretakers of children have great influence, but you don't have control.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's kind of personal, so I don't know. Are you okay with that?
I'm very okay with personal questions.
Okay,
Otherwise, I wouldn't have a DVD like that out there.
I just had to ask. So, how did when you told your family about your addiction, how did they react? And I'm talking about like your whole, did you tell your parents and your?
Oh, okay.
Because I know you said you were from a very strict background.
Well, that is a complicated question because in my story, a significant part of my story, like many, many men, is finding my father's stash when I was in junior high. And so a significant part of my story was the fact that, I would come home to an empty house. Both my parents were work at a business that they had. And so I learned, 12, 13 years old, that by getting into my father's stash of pornography, then that took away the pain and helped me go to numb, and so I didn't hurt over being home alone and being left neglected in essence. Okay? So it was about a year into my recovery, and I was actually going to be speaking at a college, the college that I went to that was still very closely connected to the church environment that my parents were in. So that is when I sent my dad a long letter, told him where I was at, told him about finding his materials, etc., etc. And so the initial reaction from my parents, my dad especially, was very good. My dad was very broken. He was very sorry. He was going to take steps and measures to deal with his own struggle. And I really thought that was going to be the beginning place of some real healing in our family. Unfortunately, that lasted about 3 weeks. And then from that point forward, my dad basically took the approach of, well, I don't do that anymore, and I don't want to talk about it, and we're never talking about it. And so from a personal standpoint, just real honest with you, that's been a real struggle in our family. In part because of the very public place that I am in now in this ministry. And it's also, but on a bigger level, it's been a struggle because of some of the necessary boundaries that we have had to maintain with our children. My daughter was 2 years old when I started my recovery. She's now 16. My son was not born yet. And so as a result of my parents' unwillingness to deal with their broken places, because, and one real critical thing to note here, it's about much more than just not acting out. It's about much, it's kind of like if you've ever heard of someone who was an alcoholic and just quit drinking but didn't do recovery. The phrase people use there is it's a dry drunk. And many times their family members wish they'd go back to drinking because they were a lot nicer when they were drinking than when they're a dry drunk. And so real honestly, my parents are in places now where we have had to keep some very clear boundaries with my children, with our children, because of their inability to relate to our kids in healthy ways. Not so much that we were ever worried about them, harming them sexually or any of those reasons, but just the reality that grandparents, the primary role for grandparents with grandchildren is to pour out and give to them unconditionally. Okay? My parents, because of not dealing with their dysfunctions, have really stayed stuck in a place of, yeah, they're giving a lot to my kids, but they're always giving to get. My daughter was probably only about 11, 12 years old the first time she said, it's really hard being around your parents because I always feel like they want me to make them okay. And when she said that, I was just like, I to be honest with you, I really struggled. Do I acknowledge that? I want to attune to her and her feelings, and at the same time, I'm kind of terrified too because she just was so spot on. She nailed it right to the key. And to be, my daughter's 16 now, and she really doesn't want anything to do with my parents. And that's a difficult struggle, but it really comes back primarily because my parents' unwillingness to engage a recovery and a healing process to be in better places. So I think I kind of took a little tangent off your question, but let me go back to your question because that is one of the questions that most people in our recovery ministry wrestle with some point in their recovery. Who do I tell? How do I tell? When do I tell? And a couple quick things there. One is I tell people all the time that who I tell really always has to be a question we take back to the Father. Because there are safe people and there are very unsafe people that we can bring into these deep struggles. And, God does call some of us, like myself, to be an open book. He doesn't call everyone to be an open book. Okay? And so what I tell people all the time is, if you're feeling like you want to tell someone, just pray about it. Ask the Father for guidance. And He may want you, that may be His conviction coming on you, that He wants you to share that. But it may also be the enemy trying to get you to share it with someone who's going to be unsafe and be difficult, be bad for your heart. And so in those places, the way you tell the difference between God's leading and the enemy's pushing is looking for the opposite places of conviction and condemnation, looking for the opposite places of love and fear. The enemy is always twisting things, and he's always pushing, whereas the Father is always gently calling and leading. And sometimes the Father calls us and leads us to difficult places, but there's always that sense of hope to it. Whereas in Romans 8:1 says, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So if there's condemning messages attached to this sense, oh, I need to tell this person, then odds are it's not, well, not odds are, condemnation is not a tool that the Father ever uses. It's only a tool of the enemy. The other thing I tell people in that regard is talking to your parents especially about this struggle, about these kinds of struggles, can't ever be about trying to get them to help you and make you okay. And what I mean by that is, one of the things that invariably comes up in the recovery process is the brokenness and the things that have not been right in the relationship. And many, as we look at our childhoods and we see what was missing, there's often a lot of anger and a lot of hurt. And we see the poor choices our parents made. And so there's a part of us that just wants to jump in and say, and get that big apology from them. Well, here's a very difficult reality. I would say of the, hundreds of couples and individuals I've worked with in this realm, I've probably only had 2 or 3 who've ever had that conversation with their parents go well. 9 out of 10 times when that conversation happens, what they experience is defensiveness, attacking. The person who is addressing the problem is the one who ends up getting blamed for the problem. And I'll give you a classic example of that is easy for me to give, because you guys got to understand, when I left for college, I can vividly remember we lived at the end of a half-mile dead-end dirt road. And I can vividly remember looking out my Mustang window as I'm driving out of my parents' place and saying, thank God I never have to spend another night in that SOB's house the rest of my life. I was furious. I was so glad to be leaving. When I went to college, however, I ended up, my dad's aunt lived about a mile away from campus. And so my escape from dorm life was to go over to my great aunt Grace's house on Saturday, do laundry, watch football, eat real food, etc., etc. I'm sure you can understand, if you're living in the dorms, why that was a great place for me to hang out on Saturdays.
They all said amen.
Pardon?
I said, and they all said amen.
Yeah. But one of the things that happened in that is that my aunt was a storyteller. And so she told story after story after story about our family's background. My dad would tell stories also, but my dad only told the good stories. My Aunt Grace had no filter. She told every story. Okay? And so out of that, what I began to see was just what an incredibly horrible, dysfunctional mess my dad came out of. Okay, let me just give you one quick story example of that. my great-grandfather, for what he would do every Saturday night for entertainment, is he would have the kids move the furniture out of the living room, and then he would take my grandfather, whose name was Bert, and he would tie his right hand behind his back, and then he would tell his sister Grace, who was 2 years younger than him, and his brother Otto, who was 3 years younger than him, to fight Bert while he sat back and watched for entertainment. Okay? What you need to understand by that is, and this wasn't just wrestling playing, this was like, MMA, let's see who can take somebody out kind of fighting. And so as I heard those kinds of stories from my aunt and realized just what a incredibly dysfunctional mess my father came out of, guess what I did? I then began to say, oh, well, it's no wonder my dad didn't handle things very well. It's no wonder that he was screwed up in these ways. So I just lifted up the rug, swept everything under, and said, okay, everything's okay now. And so I went back into the dysfunctional system without doing any work, because now I wasn't mad at my dad anymore, because in my mind it wasn't his fault. So fast forward to, I think probably maybe Thanksgiving of Christmas or Thanksgiving of my sophomore year. My sister at this time she's 3 years older than me. She was going through a lot of crap. She was really hurting. And so we were standing in the kitchen one day, and she was talking about some of the dysfunction and some of the mess of our family. And I just looked at her and I said, Judy, come on, get over it. We didn't have it too bad. At least we weren't ever physically abused or anything like that. And so what I did my sister was honestly talking about her struggles, and I just shut her down. Because the role I was playing at that point was a protector role that says, let's protect the image of our family. And so unfortunately what happens so many times is that when an individual starts finding some recovery, finding some traction, they have a heart that wants to share that with their family and bring healing for their family of origin. And that heart is really good. But what I tell them all the time is, you've got to find that healing first from your Heavenly Father, and then when you're in a place of strength, then share that. Because if you share it when you're still in a place of hurting and looking for repair, because you need the repair, then if they don't respond well, guess what? You're going to be crushed. And not only that, but when you're sharing it with a hook that's wanting something back, the odds of them being able to receive it and engage with it are very, very slim. So that was probably a lot more than you wanted with that question, but it is something that comes up quite often in our process. What else?
I had another one. Going back to how you described children in the dopamine transference and the 5-gallon bucket thing. Is that bucket only able to grow when you're in childhood? So
No, absolutely not. That's what's really cool about joy capacity. Joy capacity is something you can increase at any point, that increases any time in your life you are with people who are genuinely glad to be with you. Okay? And what's real critical, let me take that analogy a little bit further, is the reality is we all have 5-gallon buckets, and we all have a certain level of joy capacity, but we also all have holes in our buckets and are constantly leaking. All right? And what I mean by that is that any traumas you've experienced in childhood growing up, and let me explain trauma for a second. When I use the word trauma, I'm not just talking about the big traumas. Okay, for example, one of my leaders' father was an alcoholic, and his father had come home drunk, and the role my friend would take, he would get in kind of his father's way and try to occupy him and try to get him to bed so that he wouldn't beat up mom or any of the other kids. And as a result of playing that role, there were at least 2 occasions when his father just beat the crap out of him with a crescent wrench. All right? It's easy to hear that story and say, oh, well, that's trauma, and I can understand why that did great damage. Okay? But the brain actually processes trauma in the sense of anytime a painful event, circumstance, experience exceeds my joy capacity, then that's trauma. Okay? For example, many of us, most of us, have traumas from playground in first grade that if we look back on with adult perception and eyes, we go, well, that was just stupid. Well, but it was a painful thing that exceeded our capacity. All right? And so every time we experience trauma, what happens is we get a hole in our bucket. And so whatever capacity we have starts leaking out. Okay? Another real critical aspect of that is when you're in an addiction, guess what else you do? Your acting out blows new holes in your buckets. And so one of the things that we found is real critical is finding ways to increase our joy capacity. Okay, again, take that analogy. What happens if you take that 5-gallon bucket with lots of holes in it and put it under a water spigot and turn the water spigot on? Well, there's water continuing to leak out the holes, but the capacity stays high because what keeps coming in. And so guess what happens to people in that place? Well, then they're able to hang out going to trauma. We see that all the time in our recovery groups because we'll have individuals who come to us with very low capacity, but they'll come to 2, maybe even 3 recovery groups a week. They'll have lunch with guys. They'll put themselves in all sorts of places to receive more and more joy. And as long as they're doing that, guess what happens? They stay out of trauma. They start finding sobriety. They start finding the strength to resist the overwhelming temptation to act out because their capacity is managing the pain because it's greater than the pain. Okay? The reality, though, is recovery then becomes what I call a threefold process. It's putting yourself in places where your capacity is constantly being refilled. And then secondly, it's allowing God to bring healing to those old traumas as a way of patching the holes in the bucket. And then the third part of it is learning to control and manage the addictions so you stop blowing as many new holes. And the more of those 3 things you do in combination with each other, then the easier it becomes to maintain your capacity and the more you're able to handle in life without going into trauma.
Okay.
Wow.
Thank you. That was good.
I have a question for you.
All right?
I know you're running close to the edge here. If you were to design a perfect system for addressing this as a social problem, I know you could do the church and society, but so you take your pick. Maybe it'll fit both. How would you propose if the governor came to you today and said, Darrell, we think you got it. We want you to do something different. We want to do something different. What can we do? What would you say to that?
Well, it's let me get out of the governor because the government's just going to make a bigger mess of it. But anyway, I'll just paint you a picture. I've got an individual that is actually moving to Lawrence in a few weeks to dive into our recovery program. And he's diving into it really differently than any of our local people are, because he's coming here for this purpose.
Mhm.
And so here's what I've designed for him. What I've designed for him is he's going to attend all three. We have 3 different times that our men's recovery group meets. He's going to attend all 3 of our recovery groups during the week. So 3 times in a week he's going to come and spend 2 hours with other men who are wrestling with this particular struggle. In community, receiving more joy, etc., etc. Then once a week, he's going to meet with me for what I call for the Emmanuel prayer process, which is what I described about the individual who, the strip club incident. All right? So once a week, I am going to do Emmanuel prayer with him for the express purpose of trying to to provide an opportunity for God to go back and heal some of those big gaping holes in the bottom of his bucket from his childhood. All right? Then he's also going to, once a week, do a full hour-long session with a counselor who's also one of my recovery leaders, that's going to be for the purpose of trying to help him process process things that he's working on in the recovery materials, etc., and learn how to put things in place for moving forward. And so in an ideal, perfect recovery world, that's what I'd love to see, is an individual have both the opportunity, the resources, and the time to dive into really good recovery materials, to experience the grace that destroys shame. Just a quick side note here. Well, let me go ahead. I'll come back to that. And then also to have very concentrated one-on-one time that helps him to really dive into the core and deep places of his own story and his own struggle. And then, and let me backtrack quickly for a second. That also helps illustrate why individual counseling and group work so well together and often so poorly apart.
Right.
Okay? For example, when it comes to, all addiction, but especially sexual addiction, is invariably has a huge shame-based component driving it. There's invariably a deep-seated belief that there's something wrong with me, and if people really knew me, they would reject me. Okay? And so that toxic shame has to be addressed. Well, guess what? If you try to address that with a professional counselor, you can make some inroads, you can make some headway there, but there's always a little voice in the back of your mind that says, yeah, but they're a professional, they're paid, they're trained, they should be able to handle this. But when you come into a recovery group and you tell your story and you tell your worst nightmare, your worst mess, your worst sin, your worst, etc., to a group of 10 or 12 guys, 10 or 12 other people, and they're nodding their head and saying, yeah, I've been there, I've done that, and no one gets up and runs out of the room, guess what that does to the shame? It's an incredibly powerful antidote for the shame. It becomes an opportunity for God to speak His grace to us through the responses we get from the others in the room. All right? But here's where the weakness of the group setting takes place. Okay, for example, in our setting, we do big group time, which is open group discussion for an hour, and then we break up into small check-in groups of 3 or 4 guys who get in a room and talk about very specific things related to themselves for the week. All right? So if you have, let's just say even the smallest setting, you have 3 guys, 1 hour together. That leaves 20 minutes apiece. Well, guess what? You're not going to get into the deep, core root issues in 20 minutes. And on top of that, you're most likely going to be in a group with 2 other guys who have the emotional, relational maturity and skill that you do, which isn't a whole lot, or you wouldn't be here in the first place. Okay? So the counseling is very powerful because then it allows you to be with someone who hopefully has significant more maturity, training, skill to help you navigate and work through the deeper core issues. And so in my perfect recovery world, it would be a healthy combination of joy-building community, of counseling and a manual prayer that helps deal with old wounds and hurts, as well as good direction for how to navigate and learn new information, new material, new ideas, and new, better ways of coping with pain and difficult things to move forward. So does that
is
help
awesome.
at all with your direction?
Yeah, actually this whole summer I led a 6.5-day intensive experiential therapy group, Healing Sexual Issues for Men at Onsite. And I really want to get together with you now. I'm at a completely different place than when I saw you last time. I would really like to I want to take some time later on to talk with you about some things that we're doing, and maybe there's some combination things. And I think you might be interested in talking to Onsite, because I think you could do a whole training down there with this stuff.
Okay.
But I'm just throwing that out there. It's so that intensive stuff. You really need it for most people. Oops, we got an internet connection problem.
Are you there?
Yeah, it just jumped up for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it's just a bandwidth issue or something because the image just got suddenly distorted. If you can hear me, nod your head.
Well, we can see you and hear you now. There was just a message on our screen that said there was an internet problem. So.
Okay.
We've got
All right.
to
Well,
supposedly
if you
fix
can-
this. So.
Okay, well, if you can see, well, this is my experience with Skype, is it usually works really well, and then for, a couple minutes during a session or whatever, it'll go haywire.